Good morning, everybody. We're gonna get started. It's past. Good morning. Well, thank you very much for coming to this Power Friday, and we're gonna just begin with a speech from Dr. Wright, our Associate Dean for Research.
Not a speech, just a welcome. So I'm gonna welcome Barack, who welcomed me. So I want to thank Dr. Xiang and the members of the College of Education International Committee who are co-hosting and organized this workshop on a really, really important topic. So thank you, those who joined here from the room. Thank you for folks online, and especially thank you to our guest speakers and our guest from Indianapolis. And so we're looking forward to hearing from each of you. So with that, I'm going to turn back over to Dr. Xiang.
So we have two parts for this presentation. We have the first part for the plenary with the first hour focusing about 30 minutes with the plenary speech, and then 30 minutes followed by questions and answer. And then we'll transition to the panel discussions, and Chris will help facilitate that. So now I'm gonna just introduce our keynote speaker. Rebecca Grimes is the Youth Program Manager at Exodus Refugee in Indianapolis, Indiana. She has a bachelor in social work and a master in social work, and has worked with Exodus for 5 years, serving immigrants, youth, and their families. She presently works at Exodus as a school liaison and a case manager for youth, supporting both families and school as children transition into their school and community. And today she's going to be sharing her work with us, particularly on her work with refugee youth. So welcome. We have a clicker here.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me and for coming. Like you said, my name is Rebecca. I work at Exodus Refugee in Indianapolis, which is a refugee resettlement organization. I have been there for about 5 years in a few different roles. I'm currently the youth program manager, so I oversee group youth programming and also serve as like the contact between all the schools in Indianapolis and our agency, getting refugee youth and their families connected into the community and into schools and supporting them throughout that transition. I do want to start by acknowledging I personally don't have an immigrant background. I think it's important, since I will be speaking on that. I will do my best to honor my colleagues and our clients by sharing about them and their stories, but I think that is important to acknowledge first. But I have been working with Exodus, like I said, for 5 years, and so these are the things that I have learned throughout my professional journey.
Sorry. Carry on. It's fine.
Good?
Yeah. You're fine. Oh, can you not click?
Well, if you want to just start the slideshow from, there we go. So speaking as someone from Exodus, that will be kind of the context of a lot of this presentation. So Exodus Refugee, here's our mission statement. We're dedicated to the protection of human rights by serving resettlement needs of refugees and other displaced peoples who are fleeing persecution and welcoming them to Indiana. So the purpose kind of this presentation, I know this is a College of Education, but I think it's important when working with immigrant youth to understand the context and the background of where they come from and all of the different influences that are kind of affecting their life in the United States. So the initial part of this presentation is we call Refugee 101. It's just kind of a background of refugees and their status within the United States and kind of what happens overseas before the families have arrived in the United States. So a refugee, as defined by the United Nations, is someone who has a fear of being persecuted for very specific categories. They have to meet these categories in order to qualify as a refugee. They have to have a fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or having a certain political opinion. So they have to be outside their country of origin, which means they have to have crossed a border to enter a second country, and they have to be unwilling or unable to return to that country. So while there are many people who have had to flee or are displaced, in order to meet like the the definition of the United Nations to be eligible for refugee status, you do have to meet these criteria. So Exodus, we primarily work with refugees, and these are people coming through the U.S. refugee program. However, there are many other populations of immigrants that we do serve as well, including special immigrant visa holders, which are folks who assisted the United States military overseas, people seeking asylum, Cuban and Haitian entrants, certified victims of human trafficking, or people with humanitarian parole. Now, these are all different immigration categories. So there's some other folks who we also serve, people who are still seeking their immigration status, but have not yet achieved it. So looking at refugees kind of globally, it can be very alarming. So there are 82.4 million people who are displaced from their homes worldwide. 26.4 million of those are refugees. So there's a discrepancy in that number because people can be considered internally displaced. So they're still within their home country. They have not yet crossed that border, which makes them eligible for refugee status. So there are many people who are internally displaced within their own countries. And then 26 million people have had to flee their own countries and cross the border to have that refugee status. Other people making up this category are asylum seekers and others who have been displaced. So refugees in the United States are coming from various places around the world. This is a map of kind of historically who Exodus has worked with. This isn't representative necessarily of the entire country because there are other populations who are served by different cities in the United States, but Exodus primarily works with people who are from Burma, from Democratic Republic of the Congo, or from some of the smaller but still very significant populations are Syria, Iraq, Eritrea, and recently Afghanistan. As you can see over the years, immigration is ever changing. It is kind of unpredictable. So over the years, our populations have grown smaller of people that we've served. We operate on the federal fiscal year. That's what FY stands for. So it's not a calendar year that we measure our numbers. It's a 10-1, October 1 to September 30th. Well, I don't have a map yet of 2022, but as you can see, there was a very large difference between our people that we worked with in 2021 compared with this year in 2022. So we have been growing very, very quickly, and we're very glad to be working with so many families this year. So this is a list of many countries that refugees have come from in the past. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that we tend to work with more so in Indianapolis. So prior to coming to the United States, after families have had to flee their homes, we talk about kind of what have they been experiencing prior to arriving. Many people are living in refugee camps. These are designed to be temporary. However, unfortunately, the average length of stay has exceeded 21 years now for people who are living in refugee camps. They often they have limited access to education and health and livelihoods, healthcare and livelihoods. So it can be, slide, definitely not ideal living circumstances. There's basic healthcare, basic education. They don't have citizenship in the host country in which they're staying. So if a family is originally from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and they have fled to Rwanda, they still are citizens of the Congo. They are a refugee living in Rwanda, so they aren't eligible for some of the same rights that those citizens have. So they are not able to work, not necessarily able to leave the camp and find jobs or have other needs met. I thought this was a really poignant quote, which you can read for yourself, but it kind of captures the feeling of living in limbo and how extended that can become of 21 plus years of living in limbo is, yeah, really challenging. However, Not all refugees are living in refugee camps. All refugees have different stories. Many people are living in cities, which presents challenges of its own. Like I said, they don't have legal status, and so they're vulnerable to being exploited. There's competition for the low-paying jobs, and so it's still not necessarily safe for them living in the cities as a refugee. So, how does someone come from a refugee camp to living in the United States? There's actually a hyperlink here. I'm not sure if you want to up here in the top though, where it says the process. If you want to open that video.
We'll see.
I'm not sure. Sorry, I didn't give a heads up if there's audio connected.
No. The audio may be playing for the viewers.
Ah,
It may
lucky
not
them.
be playing for. Let's see. No, they're not hearing it. I'm sorry. Is that going to be a problem?
Well, there's captions. We want to keep up with the captions.
Is that?
He already has captions.
Yeah,
Oh.
you can turn them on.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Layered.
I apologize.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Do they have this video in many different languages?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So that video, if you were able to keep up, kind of describes the process that it takes overseas for somebody to be eligible for resettlement to the United States. Being a refugee is the most thoroughly vetted form of travel to the United States that exists. As you can see, there were multiple interviews that are cross-checked against each other. There are background checks, medical screens, all prior to approval for travel to the United States. However, as we all know, refugee is just one category of immigrant status, and there are many others that Exodus works with. So this graphic kind of shows the differences specifically between refugees and asylum seekers or asylees. Now they have to meet similar qualifications as someone who is fearing for their life or fearing of being persecuted for reasons related to race, religion, membership in a social group, etc. However, the difference is where do they receive that status? A refugee is processed by the United Nations and agreement with the United States, and they receive that status overseas prior to traveling to the United States. Whereas an asylum seeker or an asylee applies either at the border or once they're already in the United States. I think it is important to highlight that that is the process that we have set up, is presenting yourself at a border, at a port of entry, and applying for asylum is the legal way to seek asylum in the United States. Among other ways, you can also be in the United States in another form of visa, whether a tourist or a student visa, or enter on a valid visa and apply once you are in the United States. So there are various ways to apply for asylum, but one of those does include requesting asylum at the border.
I wish that the public in the United States recognized that and understood that instead of calling them illegals.
Yeah, it's definitely not painted that way whatsoever.
No.
Yeah. So this is just a little bit of history of refugee resettlement in the United States. Refugees have been coming to the United States since the beginning of our existence as a country. Refugee resettlement was formalized, though, as a process in 1980. This was during the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. So that created various agencies under the federal government to kind of regulate and oversee refugee resettlement. It operates annually. Every year, the president signs what's called the presidential determination, and this determines the cap, the ceiling number of how many refugees are able to enter the country that fiscal year. That is cap. That doesn't mean that that many people are actually going to arrive. It's not typical that we are able to meet that number of resettlement just due to all of the bureaucracy that has to take place, all of the different players involved of getting somebody eligible to travel. In my 5 years, we've never met that cap. And yeah, the president is required to consult with Congress in determining that presidential determination number for the year. So that's kind of logistically how the U.S. operates the resettlement program. And then the services on the ground are managed by agencies like Exodus nationwide, and these agencies provide the resettlement services through contracts with the government. This graphic shows kind of how, like I was saying, immigration is unpredictable and ever-changing. This is a graph showing how our numbers of refugees admitted to the United States have changed over time from the beginning in 1980, which was the start when they started formally having that refugee program, to 2020. I don't have the most recent years. We have experienced an increase, as you saw, based on the numbers that Exodus was working with. But yeah, as you can see, it has kind of dropped over time, and it definitely ebbs and flows year to year. So I think it's important to talk about the Afghan evacuees, because that has been the main population, I would say, that Exodus has been working with in the past year. That was it was unique. They did not come through the typical refugee process in that they did not go through the however many years in a refugee camp. It was like an emergency evacuation. And so rather than processing taking place overseas, processing took place at military bases in the United States. It was slow because the health screenings and the security screenings took place over a number of months. And so back in August of 2021 was when the evacuation took place. Exodus started receiving families probably in November, was when we really started to see an increase in Afghans being assigned to us. Afghans have a status called humanitarian parole. This is not technically refugee status, although they may meet those definitions. That is not the status that they have in the United States. This is a temporary status for 2 years, and so the next step in the process is to apply for asylum in order to become a permanent resident in the United States. So that process is what is happening right now. They were not automatically granted asylum. It's something that they are being required to apply for. Some of them do qualify for other immigration categories as well, such as special immigrant visa. We have resettled more than 340 in Indianapolis, and there were multiple agencies in the state who were working with Afghans. So this work is definitely going to continue over the next months and years as we are trying to support those families, as we do all of our clients, adjusting to life in the U.S. So what does the resettlement agency do? Like, what are our services? Here's a brief overview of, there are some things that we are required to do per our contract with the government, and then our goal is to go above and beyond that, as we know many families have needs beyond what the services are that are expected of us. But services include housing, getting housing set up for families prior to them coming. Everybody gets a case manager for the first 3 months, and that person is like their point person, helping them apply for public assistance, getting a family doctor, doing home visits to ensure that the family is doing well and they have what they need. We also offer English classes and employment services to help folks find jobs and learn English. Get them enrolled in school, which is my job. And then we also offer a lot of ongoing services. 3 months is a really short turnaround time to expect a family to be what we call self-sufficient. I can't imagine being like dropped in a new country and expected to support myself and my family just in 90 days. Many families do though. We help them find jobs. They have a community that they're connected to. However, many do require some support beyond that initial 90 days. So we have some supportive programs, longer term case management for people with medical or mental health concerns, or just families who are more vulnerable. Large families, single parents, these are the folks that often have greater odds stacked against them of being able to be independent within those 90 days. So a little bit about refugee resettlement, specifically in Indiana, since we are all Hoosiers or maybe Hoosier transplants, I'm not sure, but we are here in Indiana. So Indiana has 4 resettlement agencies. So Exodus has 2 offices, one in Bloomington, which is new, and then one in Indianapolis. And then also there's Catholic Charities, and they have offices in both Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. Indianapolis is a very lucrative area. There are lots of available jobs. You have lots of warehouse and hospitality jobs, and it is more affordable than other parts of the country. And then we also have large populations of people. So like, for example, people from Burma. Indianapolis has the largest population of Burmese people outside of the country of Burma. And so this allows people to have support in their community, people who speak their own language. And so that definitely brings people to Indianapolis. Nora is like northern Indianapolis.
Oh.
Yeah. Southport is the south side. But those specific, smaller neighborhoods within the city have large Burmese populations. Also, there are many benefits to the United States to refugee resettlement. Obviously, they bring cultures and languages and experiences that are new to us. Lots of great restaurants. We also have a worker shortage in Indiana, and so we are in need of more people to fill jobs. And a study found that over $63 billion in revenue was brought from refugees compared to the cost up front. So immigrants are an economic benefit to the country, and I think that is also not something that is commonly talked about. Okay, so that is kind of a quick version of refugee youth, or refugee resettlement. Now we'll pivot to talking specifically about refugee youth, since We are in the College of Ed.
Excuse me, can I ask a quick question?
Of
before we
course.
continue? Based on what you were talking about before, you said the United States fulfills and maintains global leadership position by showing allies what aid should look like. However, what I've read is that the U.S. acceptance rate of refugees is per capita is substantially lower than many of the Scandinavian countries, Canada, and
Yeah,
other countries. So what is this global leadership that they're showing people?
I think that bullet point is aspirational. I think that is, I think that is an argument for why refugee resettlement should take place. It does not mean that that's necessarily what is happening.
Yeah,
But,
and I think if you were talking to our undergrads or something who aren't here, I think that this is what they fully believe and subscribe to, that the United States, Americans donate more money, they provide more assistance. So to say it's an aspirational goal, it's a lot different than to have that. So
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So kind of going back into a background of working with refugee youth, what has their education story been? There is no like common story. Every family is unique, and their story is unique, and their circumstances are unique. However, some trends that we tend to see, here's some statistics. Of the 7 million refugee youth worldwide, about half of them are not in school. Many attend primary school, but very few get a secondary education. And the reasons for this, often school is interrupted due to family displacement. So also there's a cost to attend school at times. Sometimes there are schools available to kids outside the camp, but that is for, like, you have to pay a fee for that. And also fees for school supplies and school uniforms prevent many families from being able to send their kids to schools. There are large classroom sizes, 75 plus students in the classroom commonly, and have limited curriculum. And oftentimes students, as they get older, once they may be in secondary education, have to leave school to be able to support their families in making money to be able to survive in the camp. So all of these reasons really limit education for our refugee youth before they're coming to the United States. So once they're here, here's some common things that I like to go over. I often do this presentation with teachers in schools who are starting to work with more refugee youth in their classrooms. And so I like to say, kids have a lot of shared experiences, no matter if they're a refugee, if they're an American student. To a certain degree, kids have common experiences. Some things to know, though, for immigrant youth that may not be experiences that American youth have had. First of all, of their family dynamics. Many times when working with parents and you ask why did you choose to be resettled to the United States? And their answer is for the children, for the kids to have a better opportunity. And so that can create expectations for the kids, either that they place on themselves internally, like they want to be able to be successful and support their families, or placed on them by parents and relatives. There is an expectation and a hope for them to be successful, to reach a certain education level. There's also a role transition that takes place for honestly any immigrant youth, including refugees, because they're in school full time. They learn English oftentimes quicker than their parents. They kind of become the expert and relied upon by the parents to help navigate U.S. society. That is not finished, but to complete adult tasks, helping parents to pay bills, interpreting for phone calls when somebody calls them without an interpreter, picking up a job after school to be able to cover the cost of rent. So these are, that kind of changes the power dynamic in the family, in that youth have more power than maybe they previously did before coming to the United States, and they're definitely relied upon in order for their family to survive. Another thing that happens is culture shock. This is the phenomenon of kind of being dropped in a new country that is so vastly different from the culture of your home country. The symptoms, I guess you could call the signs that somebody may be experiencing this exhaustion. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like boredom, maybe retreat to things that are familiar, lack of engagement in the classroom or in extracurricular activities. It's important to note that this is not laziness. This is just a reaction to such a dramatic change in environment. And every person goes through this process at a different rate. So someone may be in the country for however many years, 1 or 2 years, and the youth, although very adaptable, definitely may still be experiencing this adjustment. This is a table that I found really helpful, put together by the Boston Children's Hospital. They have been doing a lot of research into working cross-culturally with youth, specifically for mental health supports, but it really shows like a lot of the contradictions in cultural expectations between the US, which is an incredibly independent culture, and the interdependent cultures of all of the families that we are working with. So, for example, in the US, we're structured, we have professionally, we have roles and limit setting, whereas those structures and those expectations may not exist for a lot of the families that we work with. Another concept of time, Americans are very efficient, whereas concept of time in a lot of the countries we work with is very flexible, and that requires a lot of education on our part to educate our families on how the U.S. operates, and also allows us to learn lessons from our families of the ways in which they're able to take a step back. I've learned a lot from clients when I have a very rigid schedule and like 10 things I need to do in a day, and I go to a family's home and they have a meal laid out for me. I kind of have to like throw my to-do list out the window and readjust on the fly because they are like inviting me to share in their hospitality. Definitely individual interests. For the United States, we value and encourage those, whereas in many of our cultures that we work with, those individual interests are subordinate to whatever the family or the group needs. And so I think when working with immigrant or refugee youth, it's important to know that they're having to flip back and forth. When they're in school, they're in a United States context where they are trying to abide by and pick up on the cues of the independent culture, making friends from many different places, many American friends, and then when they go back home, they have to kind of flip back. And that can be really challenging. It can be exhausting. It contributes to that culture shock. And it also sometimes can be difficult to kind of bring your whole family in on that when your parents, they're not necessarily being immersed as much as the students are in the US schools. And so that sometimes can create some tension, kind of the push and pull of different cultures within one household. And it can be difficult for immigrant youth. Although they're also expected to do their homework and get good grades and study and have a job, like all of these things are kind of on their shoulders. And so I think it's important to remember the unseen things behind the students in the classroom. So recommendations for working with refugee youth: always view them through a strengths perspective and seeing the assets of what they bring to the table. Incredible resiliency, incredibly adaptable to be able to switch back and forth like I was talking about. They're innate problem solvers because that is what they kind of have to do, and many of them develop those skills so quickly, or they already have them from overseas. It's important to have cultural humility, just to have a posture of listening and learning, having interest in their story without sensationalizing it. I think a lot of times that can happen when talking about refugee stories, and the reality is that that's just their story, and that is their life, and we don't want to otherize our students by making them feel that way. Definitely point out to students what they already know and how that connects to their education. And also some recommendations of what not to do. Asking students to share the specifics of their family story if they're not willing to present that themselves, or reducing their experiences to that of a victim. Like we said, every refugee has a different story, and they have so many assets that to consider them just a victim of their circumstances is really doing them a disservice and doing us a disservice. And also not to generalize. Like we have been talking about, everyone has a different experience. Logistically, it's important to know how to problem solve when working like cross-culturally with someone. If you have an appointment, you have to know how to get the logistics down, and there are many miscommunications that regularly happen, and many times they can be laughed off if you have a good nature about you, but something I go over with teachers is different ways of communicating. A lot of times families may not have like service on their phones, but they have WhatsApp, or they just solely use WhatsApp to communicate with each other. And so being able to adapt to that, kind of leaning into that interdependent culture. If you're struggling to get a hold of somebody, contacting their family and their friends to see if they can help you out, somebody get a new phone number. Also, when communicating, it's important to simplify like jargon language, and to like reiterate and repeat, not talk louder. There are many people who are trying their best to get a point across, but sometimes that is not helpful. Let's see. Language services. It's important to talk about best practices. It is always best practice to use an interpreter. That is the right that families have. It's a law in the United States, and the Department of Ed says that you have to provide equal access to families who do not speak English, the same translated services, interpreted services that would be available to an English speaker. This is unfortunately not always followed within schools. That is the reality. They're trying their best, but it is not always adequate. So it requires a lot of advocacy from the direct service staff and people who are advocating on the rights of our students to be sure their families have access to interpreted materials. Children should never be used as interpreters. I would hope that that would be obvious, but it is not. There are many people, they don't know that they can call an interpreter within the schools, or it's too much of a hassle. I have heard stories from my clients. A teen client came to me and said that he had to interpret for his dad a meeting about his attendance issues at school, which just is, I mean, it happens. It doesn't make any sense. It also puts, can exacerbate that role differential within the family when kids are asked to interpret sensitive information, medical information for their families. That is a lot of pressure for kids, especially, I mean, very young ages. There are people who are expecting the youth to be able to help them communicate with their parents, and that's just not appropriate for them. So yeah, that's important to consistently reinforce and be aware of, knowing that unfortunately not all schools are following and providing this for families. There's a few other ways. This is an Exodus PowerPoint, so we're just gonna roll with it. Specifically of how to get involved with Exodus, or our social medias try to keep up to date on what's going on with immigration and refugee resettlement in the United States. So if you want to keep up to date, there are ways to do that. Yeah, I know we're not in Indianapolis, so a lot of these may not be relevant, but the slide was in there, so there we go.
All right, thank you very much. And now we have about 17, 18 minutes for questions and answers. So I'll open up for people here if you have any questions. And for those joining us virtually, you can drop in the chat if you have any questions. We're gonna read it out.
I'll start with the questions. I was curious, I know there's just a lot of, of course, politicalization of refugee immigration. And there's currently something happening with the Venezuelan refugees at the border. So I didn't see Venezuela on your list of who's coming to Indianapolis. Is that,
Yeah,
they're not coming in, or they're being resettled else, or what's the situation of the Venezuelan refugees?
so I would say, so our biggest population at Exodus is people who have refugee status prior to coming to the United States. And that's not it's not an opportunity for people from Venezuela. In order to be granted refugee status, there has to be a UN presence in or around that country. And there's not really that processing set up in Central America. So whereas many people who are in Venezuela, Honduras, El Salvador, many of those countries that we are maybe seeing apply for asylum, going through that asylum process at the border, they do not have refugee status ahead of time. There is something new happening with Venezuela. I got an update about it regarding, I think they were granted temporary protection status, which is like it's kind of like a temporary status. I think it's oftentimes 2 years. I don't know specifically for this one. There are new categories that have been opened up, new immigration pathways for Venezuela specifically. That has been very recent. So I don't have the most updated. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I know we have some attorneys on staff at Exodus that gave us a little update a couple weeks ago about that. So.
And I believe there's a pretty sizable Venezuelan population in Indianapolis, but you're saying they're just not fitting into the category of the clientele for access there.
And we do offer services to people who are not refugees, or who are not our direct clients. Sometimes many people are moving to Indianapolis, and so if maybe they were resettled in another state originally, they're still eligible for our services. And we also, not through our government contract, but have branched out on some of our other services and are offering services to asylum seekers, people who have not yet received that asylum status. There are very little services for folks who do not yet have that status, and so we're trying to meet that need. So a lot of the families, either from Venezuela, a lot from Haiti, a lot from Cuba, they are finding Exodus once they're in Indianapolis, and we are able to offer some of our limited services, English classes, some case management, whatever we can to kind of support them. So, yeah.
Kind of a follow-up to what William was mentioning. I tried to read the list, but I couldn't read it all. But I noticed Bhutan was on the list of sources for refugees. And I think that right there, you kind of destroyed a stereotype of mine, which is who would ever want to leave Bhutan, based on gross national happiness scales and all those other things. So what category of refugee, how do they claim refugee status coming from Bhutan? Is it religious oppression or?
To be very honest, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think that list was historically ever from Exodus, who have we ever served,
Okay.
and that was long before my time.
Okay.
I have not worked with any Bhutanese
Yeah.
refugees personally, but
So
maybe someone else can
A
answer.
little bit about that, as I'm doing a study on Bhutanese refugees.
Mhm.
So in Bhutan, Bhutanese refugees are Nepali speaking Hindu people. So therefore, the language, in terms of language speakers, about 25% Nepali speakers were there. Dzongkha is the main language, official language, and about 26% Dzongkha speakers were there. So there was like after 1970s, there was like ethnic cleansing movement. So they imposed the law of speaking Dzongkha language only, no Nepali language in school, and they had to wear the national dress. And then the Nepali-speaking Bhutanese refugees were living in the southern part of Bhutan. That was quite hot, and they had to wear thick clothes. And after that, like there was some movements. The Bhutanese refugees launched there for their rights, and they were now prosecuted and then vandalized, raped, and a lot of people were imprisoned. And finally, from 1990s, about 100,000 Bhutanese, they had to flee from Bhutan, and they were resettled in Nepal. And there was like negotiations to resettle them in Bhutan, but that was fair. Then from 2008, with the help of UN agency, UNHCR, US received about 70,000, I guess, refugees from China.
Thank you. Brenda, there's no such thing as paradise on earth. I mean, there's always oppression, whether it be like religion and others. Thank you.
Here's about the overview of the federal level policy. I'm wondering at the state level, unique opportunities or challenges.
That's a great question. It's a federal program, and so there was a time that there was discussion of states were going to have to require to opt in or out. That was a policy that was being considered that has been thrown out. That's not an option anymore. But depending in the future, like policies like that may pop up that allow states to have kind of more influence on like refugee resettlement compared to the federal influence. From personal experience, I would say state level influences refugee resettlement a lot more once they're here and them operating within that state system. All of the states have different policies that they follow regarding like public benefits, offering different benefits amounts, different systems of how to access those benefits. And so you have to operate within whatever state you're in. And so maybe just like logistically, the states are affecting outcomes and refugee well-being based on the systems that they have set up within, but not necessarily the numbers that are coming, if that makes sense.
So with Catholic Charities and Exodus Refugees, both operating in Indianapolis, like how does that work in terms of who gets who?
Yeah, that is a good question. There are people who are, so above each of our agencies are like federal programs that kind of send people to us. So it's not decided by us, yeah. Or
Okay.
they subcontract it to our agency that we're affiliated with. It's called Church World Service. So there's a few layers of subcontracting that the families kind of filter through until they are assigned. If a family, like if an Exodus client came like 4 years ago and they're familiar with us, they may request that their family come through Exodus compared to Catholic Charities or vice versa. But that is a decision that's generally made before families come to us.
I'm sorry, I have to step out for a second.
Oh,
I don't know if
that's
this question was asked or not. But you work with youth,
Yes.
you know, so I think you said that you work with enrolling students into schools.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys do some work with teachers that are getting refugee students? And I ask you this because I come from San Antonio, and some years ago, we had a very big influx of refugees from Iraq and from Iran that completely overwhelmed, you know, our schools, particularly in one school district, and it was my neighborhood school. And it put a lot of pressure, obviously, on the school and the teachers. And one of the issues that came up, it was, you know, teachers also not knowing how to navigate, you know, now this new as it is, you know, I mean, they're overworked, underpaid, and now we're being asked to add this extra layer of complexity to their work. So there was we started doing some partnering with schools in providing support to teachers regarding, you know, like from language learning to just like socio-emotional. So do you guys do any type of work with schools or with teachers regarding, you know, the transition of students into the U.S. public school system?
Yeah, so I have two answers. One, we try to work closely with the EL departments, the English language departments within each school district. There are a lot of school districts in Indianapolis. I worked with maybe 10 last year. And so working kind of individually with each EL department to see how we can support them, because they were kind of the ones that were offering that support and continuing education to the teachers. Specifically, a similar experience when there was the Afghan evacuation and there was such a large influx of Afghan students in such a short amount of time. So trying to support with cultural materials and trainings and working closely with the district level staff as they were trying to support the teachers through that process. Also, something that Exodus does, I think, I hope other agencies do this, is we meet individually with each family prior to them starting school, and we do, I call it youth cultural orientation, which families, adults receive overseas prior to coming to the United States. I don't know if you caught that in the video. There was a step where they have to kind of go through lessons about living in the United States. And so we do kind of an onboarding to school with families, talking about school laws and school policies and calling in when your kids are absent, and parent-teacher conferences. Recently, I was working with a family and her son needed some extra IEP services. And so I was trying to help facilitate that conversation with the school. And it required, I didn't realize she was very hesitant to say anything about her son's needs when we were in the meeting with the school counselor. And it came out with the help of the interpreter and us kind of figuring out the conversation that she was very nervous she was offending the teachers by implying that like their teaching was not adequate to support her son. So just knowing like what communication norms are with schools and what parent rights are, try to cover that as much as we can, but it definitely, it doesn't solve, everything. It's just like a process over time of trying to provide support to teachers who are really on the front lines of this. Once we get the students into schools, I try to support, but I don't always keep in touch with the students, and the hope is that they're connected to other people in the community, like the teachers. So it's a good point that really educating and supporting the teachers in the schools is kind of the essential piece of helping students feel comfortable in their community. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, it
It's a
curious,
good,
yeah.
it was a good, it's a good reflection.
Sorry, I have babies questions. You mentioned that when families settle here, they help parents find jobs.
Yes.
And you help students find schools.
Yes.
Do you help the parents or the adults in the family provide access to education? Like if they were a teacher, this is a situation that happened in Canada a lot. A lot of refugees come to Canada,
Yep.
and they're already certified teachers in their own country. Canada provides a one-year program to orient them to the Canadian education system so they can enter then as teachers in Canada.
Yeah.
So that's a form of re-education or educating them. Do you guys work on that kind of thing too?
We do.
Mhm.
When people have those qualifications, we try our best to get them connected to be certified in the U.S. We're bound by the U.S. or like those specific policies. Like for example, in the medical field, I know a number of people who were doctors overseas, and they're not able to practice here until they pass like a very lengthy, basically have to go back through medical school is my understanding of it. More or less, you might have to, it might be shortened a little bit, but it is like very daunting. So when it is an opportunity for like licensures to transfer to be eligible to work in the United States, we definitely do help with that. But
Thank you.
yeah.
I have a lot of questions too, sorry. Some states had governors and state legislators that are very hostile to refugee resettlement. What's been your experience with Indiana?
So I know that there was a few years back, there was a lawsuit against the governor of Indiana, who was attempting to prevent Syrian refugees from resettling in Indiana, which was successful. So that he was not able to enact that. Now I think I know a lot of Exodus staff above me have been able to meet with the governor or like his assistants, and so we're working on building that rapport. And I think at this moment it is like a positive relationship in that they feel that refugees are an asset to Indianapolis and our communities. This is the language that's coming out. I can't speak to their personal beliefs, but yeah.
Well, thank you. We have about 2 minutes for maybe one more questions, if you have any, before we transition to the panel discussion. Yeah, anybody online?
So you had one T-shirt sale online.
Love it.
All right, so
Okay, I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. How does one become certified as a victim of human trafficking? Because you said they have to be certified as victims before they're considered within a certain status.
Yeah, I believe there's an application and probably interview process similar to someone seeking asylum. That generally you need a lawyer assisting you to navigate that process where they ask probably very personal questions about your experiences, and you have to meet certain qualifications.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
well, thank you very much. So join me. Thank you. And now we're gonna transition to our panel, and Chris is gonna help facilitate that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
so I'm Chris. I'm the grad student on the International Committee, or one of the two. So next we're going to have our panel that I believe is called Refugee Experience, Supporting Families, Students, and Communities. So we have three awesome panelists. We've got Dr. Xiang, Zhou, who's an assistant professor in the counseling psychology program. Dr. Sarmiento-Quezada, who is an assistant professor in literacy and language. And Brenda, Shein, who is a PhD student in the counseling psychology program. So the way we'll format this is they'll each have about 10 minutes to give a presentation, and then with whatever time is left, we'll have a Q&A for everybody at the end. So we're going to start with Dr. Zhou, who is presenting on challenges in accessing care among Burmese refugee families of children with autism spectrum disorder.
Is that the PowerPoint on Burmese? Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Give me 1 second to share. Sure. Should be good, yes.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks, Rebecca, for the presentation. I found I can try to save some time. I know it's only 10 minutes to be mindful of other speakers' time. Some of the background slides, as my topic is around Burmese family, and I think there has been a lot of context provided in the keynote speaker's presentation. But with one of the largest resettled refugee populations in Indiana, there has been a plethora of health and social disparities I think we can potentially dive into. But today's presentation, I really want to focus on the autism spectrum disorder related disparity that current day we don't have actually any data documented to sort of describe the phenomenon itself. But we do know certain things. For example, there are ethnic, racial, and economic disparities in delayed autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. That is, ethnic, racially minoritized communities, as well as economically marginalized communities, tend to have their children, the children from these families tend to have a delayed diagnosis, which has huge implications for the prognosis of their treatment over the long term. We do know that immigrants and refugees from a lot of Asian countries tend to report less knowledge about what is autism spectrum disorder compared to their domestic counterparts, and prefer to categorize developmental delay. So that is something by developmental delay that implies their parents do not need to do much. This will be sort of caught up as children were developing normally. So that's sort of deterring them from seeking out further professional help. We also know that from CDC studies, Burmese refugees tend to have lower health literacy, that is knowledge about sort of general physical health related knowledge and how to navigate the healthcare system compared to their domestic counterparts, which is all not surprising. So adding all these together, we tend to we could picture how AS disparity could be an overlooked health disparity issue among many resettled refugee communities. And part of this research is also driven by our community partnership in the last few years, hearing stories from Burmese communities and from Burmese families that they are seeing this as a rising concern. In fact, 2 Burmese churches in the last few years already have parenting support groups within their church just for families with autism spectrum disorder. So you can see that has become a notable issue even within the community. The broader study that it's an ongoing study that me and my colleague from IUPUI are currently undertaking. Is funded by the NIH Clinical and Translational Science Institute. But today I'm only going to focus on the first piece of the study, that is to interview stakeholders. That includes families, include healthcare providers, as well as community stakeholders such as church leaders or Sunday school teachers, to understand their perspectives on the needs and help-seeking experiences for Burmese families. So far, and today, I'm only going to speak on the healthcare provider interview portion, given we only have 10 minutes for this presentation. We had 6 healthcare providers interviewed in the last 3 to 4 months. 2 of them are psychologists, 2 of them are speech language pathologists, 2 of them are social workers, 3 of them are working in a hospital setting, 2 at school setting. 1 is pre-K, 1 is primary school level, and then 1 is at a community healthcare setting. All of them are white women. The interviews were conducted over Zoom. We conducted thematic analyses, trying really to address the research question here: what are the healthcare providers' perspectives on Burmese families' help-seeking experiences regarding autism spectrum disorder? So with that, I'm going to dive into some of the themes. I think that's sort of the main part of what we're trying to find through this phase of the study. The first theme is around family characteristics. Perhaps it would not be surprising to anyone that a lot of immigrant and refugee families have little knowledge about autism spectrum disorder. In fact, in Burmese languages, though there's no translation for the entity that doesn't exist, and that's the case for many refugee communities. But here, I also want to include some quotes, and throughout this presentation, not only the challenges, but also perhaps positive attributes and strength of the family. One of the challenges the participant 4 reported was, over times, we have kids who are referred in closer to 3 or 4, but Burmese children coming in a little bit older. And the other thing I noticed is oftentimes the identification is coming through school first. So they were provided school-based support and coming for medical diagnosis to get further service treatment. So the first part, you can see that collaborate with the past literature of the delayed diagnosis among many immigrant and refugee communities. Participant 4's sort of note of this dual diagnosis, that is school-based diagnosis as well as medical-based diagnosis, referred to dual diagnosis, is also talked about by participant 5. So these Burmese families are willing to go that extra mile. Most have a dual diagnosis and have dual supports than my white kids, because again, when they have a status as a refugee, there are people such as Asst following up with them on the care of their children, the progress of their personal jobs and careers. So having those extra layer of support, according to this clinician, sees that as more support that potentially connect them with diagnosis that has lead to more access to services at school and outside the school setting. Interpretation is a huge piece. I have heard a lot about the interpretation challenges. For many immigrant refugee families or families who don't speak English as a first language, this is common, right, in school-based services, in healthcare, help seeking. So this quote by participant 2, one strength of our clinic is we have in-house interpreters, which we try to have them in person. If it is by the phone, the quality has drastically decreased. However, even with an in-person interpreter, we sometimes have the feeling that we're talking in different words. It is not uncommon at all for clinicians, whether in this study or many other my students, talk about when they're seeing clients through an interpreter, they are just not hearing the answers. That's what even they're asking for at the first place. So these are, I want to say, common challenges for people working through interpreters. But there's a piece of having children translating, right? Of course, it is not an ideal situation, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, but I think this quote really exemplifies some of even the nuances that even when clinicians know that, sometimes it's hard to prevent that from happening. So this clinician said, this is complicated information, meaning ASD-related diagnosis and treatment. And even if you have good English for every day, you may want someone to talk to help you through this, because we're going to talk about words that aren't very common. I had a family where the 10-year-old brother was there, and the mom did not want an interpreter, and she wanted her son to do it. And the worst part of it was the parent wanted to talk about the fact when the younger child was born, they had a big trauma in their family. The whole family couldn't respond to this boy because they were experiencing this trauma. So a 10-year-old is asking me, did we cause this? And that quote really made me heartbroken thinking about the nuances of challenges when families refuse interpretation service, even when the clinic offers that. And when we talk to, in other studies, this phenomenon of language brokering, is very common in immigrant families. And there are also teenagers who say they prefer to translate because they felt they're providing better services than the medical interpreters, right? So there are a lot of push and pull from clinicians or teachers trying to use the service versus families sometimes may not want to use their services. Another layer added on top is the languages of from Burma and Myanmar. Some of you may or may not know that over about 100 languages were spoken in Myanmar and Burma. Among them are 6 major families of languages. Many of these languages were not communicable across each other. So the added layer for a lot of clinics is trying to figure out the correct interpreter to be invited. As participant 1 said, this only happened again a couple of times, but they just cannot find, say, a Chin interpreter at that time, or an interpreter was booked either virtually or in person, and it's just a wrong dialect. Do we just make the family come to this appointment, and we're not going to be able to service them? Or it's that sort of fumbling around to get the right dialect, and then that cuts the appointment short. All families react to ASD diagnosis and treatment in different ways. There are no sort of common story, but this quote, I think, highlights some of the cultural nuances the clinician spoke to. Almost always, it's you are the professional where whatever you think needs to be done. Honestly, sometimes I would like a little pushback from these families. That is, but I know that, again, that's a cultural component. I know they have gone to professionals and they have told them not to speak their native language at home because of language delay for a lot of children, because that will hurt their English skills. No, it's okay to question those things. And I would welcome questions, but almost always the reaction from these families is, if you think so, go ahead. The last piece from the preliminary findings, or the education and training piece. One speech language pathologist noted, I don't feel like my education prepared me for this. I had never heard about an EL evaluation until I came to this school district. And this is now the first district I worked in. A psychologist says this is in response to the assessment tool for autism spectrum disorder. There are notable potentially culturally biased items, such as asking children to arrange a birthday party and see how they're following through kind of a typical American birthday party arrangement. As you can see, for many immigrants and refugee families, not only they don't know what's an American birthday party, they may have not had one in a refugee camp before. But psychologists also noted, I usually could figure it out, even when some of the items might be culturally biased. I feel like I can get enough data from other assessment questions, from their from clinical observations, I can confidently say yes or no. Message. It seems from most of the clinicians, clinics we talk to, they're aware of the unique service needs. In fact, a lot of them were sort of asking our team, has there been an uptake of ASD cases? Because that's what they're feeling, but there are no document data around this, and they wonder whether trauma or dual language development contributed to some of the uptake in ASD diagnosis. They also realized and noted the challenges they're facing in their work, such as interpretation, services use, as well gaps in their training and education. So I'll leave my presentation there.
Thank you so much. All right, next we have Dr. Sarmiento-Quezada, and she will be presenting on identity, language, and third space formation of displaced populations. And this is the link.
The Google link.
Okay.
I don't know how I'm gonna do this in 10 minutes.
You talk fast. I know you do.
I don't know, guys. Bear with me. And I have my little like cheat sheet of facts and figures, so if you see me pull it, because I didn't want to put it in there. I had a little bit of not a hard time, but like trying to figure out what I wanted to talk to you about. So I went back to this project that I've been working on, and it was part of my.
I'm not logged in, so I probably will have to click for you. If you just tell me, I'll take you to the next slide.
All right. Okay. Well, I guess let's go on to the next slide. So quick overview. This presentation, my talk, I want to talk to you about some of the spaces that language was used to construct and display identities in every day of the participants in this particular study. I looked at social media interactions and in-person events. And I noticed how my participants started creating and navigating third bins, and I will introduce my participants really quick. And one of the things that came out of this is I started observing how they continuously shifted and performed their identities between between languages and between their identities, and they really became cultural brokers. But in order to give you a little bit of context, we can go into the next. So this project is based off of Mexico. So I looked at displaced population, displaced Syrian students who lived in Mexico. And I decided to focus, and I was going to ask you that question about, like maybe like age differences on the people that arrived here. So one of the most understudied group populations of displaced populations is adult youth. When you are like in the ages of around 18 and 23, 24, we tend to focus on the K-12 and we tend to focus on the adults. But then there is this gap, what is happening when they are arriving. Oh, thank you.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. What happens, at this age, and this is such an important stage of development. We're asking also, we're asking our youth to make lifelong decisions about where they're going with their life. And when we're talking about displaced populations, like how, as countries, how are we helping with that transition? Or if there is even a path for them to do that transition. So I did my study in Mexico because my participants, so actually before that, I looked at some of the resources that displaced students enact, and I just want to emphasize that I call them displaced students versus refugees because they asked me to do that. They are very aware of the word refugee and what it means for them and the way that the public views them versus when they call themselves displaced students or international students, which I'll talk about in a second. And I center on the social spaces that they create in Mexico, their language practices and their identity construction. So again, this is where my cheat sheet comes with my numbers. So the Syrian conflict, as we know, it started in March 15 of 2011. As of the latest UN data that was released, there have been 6.6 million Syrians who have fled the country, and then 6.7 who have been displaced internally. When this project started taking place, I started looking at this particular population that was arriving in Mexico, and this happened in around 2016. So in 2016, 2017, there was a lot of political change here in the United States, and Syrian refugees were not being admitted into the country. So the question is like, what are other countries doing? You know, so I found that Mexico was receiving Syrian displaced students, and it's a very interesting story. It was this man who works at an international organization who was volunteering at a refugee camp. He was from Mexico, and he started noticing that in refugee camps in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon, there were a lot of 17, 18, 19-year-old students. And he realized these were brilliant, like individuals, and they were helping a lot to the international organizations. So he asked them, like, what do you want to do? You know, what is it that you want to do? And they were like, well, our goal is to go to school, to study. But the thing is, like, once you arrive, for example, to certain European countries or to the United States after the age of 18, especially, depending on when you arrive, you might not be entitled to go into the K-12 system. And you pretty much are, told that you have your 3 months to get your life together, get a job, and get running. So we're talking about 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds whose lives and dreams have been completely shattered because of something that they've been dealing with for the past 10 years. So then this man decided to be like, you know what? When I go back to Mexico, I'm gonna find a way in which you guys can come and go to college over here. And that's what he did. They tell me, they're like, oh, we really thought that he was just, like making it up. But he did. So he went back to Mexico, and then through his institution, his university, he started pulling together with professors, and they came up with a plan on how they could start bringing, these students who were really pretty much in limbo at a refugee camp and being able to come into Mexico and start higher ed. So this is kind of like where this context is coming from. As of the time of this, so Mexico it's interesting. So we are, and I say we because I am from Mexico. So we are considered a country of immigrants, even though we're seen as a country who sends immigrants. But there's a big, long history of open doors in Mexico. We've had a lot of waves of immigration. And this is not, different. So in 2016, there was a conference in the United Kingdom called Supporting Syria and the Region Conference, where Mexico pledged monetary pledge for $1.9 million dollars in order to support children. But they never really made a pledge on resettling refugees, and they never really followed through on that monetary pledge. So Mexico as a country hasn't done much, and it's been mostly done through individual organizations, nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations that have made this type of coming into a country possible. You're gonna have to let me know when I'm almost done, because I can talk about this for days. So anyway, really quick, so during emergency and conflict situations, there is this thing designated by the United Nations, and it's called the Education and Emergency Programs, in which they pretty much funnel money to educational programs for in-school and out-of-school activities to support students. But as you can imagine, a lot of this support goes to K-12. And a lot of it happens within the classroom context. And so my question is, well, what happens outside the classroom? How are we supporting our students outside the classroom, and how are we supporting, those that are not within the K-12 system? So in this, for this project, I looked, my framework, I looked at identity, performances, thirst rates, and language ideologies of my participants. And I did it in 2 sites, well, 3 sites when you consider the social network as a 3rd site. But I did it in Mexico City and in Guadalajara. So Mexico City is the capital city of Mexico. And then Guadalajara is the 2nd largest city in the country. And I did an in-person data collection where I met my participants for 4 weeks, and then it got interrupted by COVID-19. So I had to like redo everything that I was doing, and I extended the focus on my virtual data collection, which worked out great because they were already in university, most of their instruction also went online and they couldn't go anywhere. Mind you, my focus on this was not to focus in the institution and their participation within the institution, but I wanted to look outside at the social environment that they were creating for themselves as they were navigating this new environment in Mexico. So I wanted to look how they're using their language to construct their identities and how they're creating and navigating new spaces. So I'm just going to skip. So my participants, I had 3 focal participants who I met when they had so this is Layla. She's at the time of the study, she's 22 years old. Then I have Lavend, and then I have Sami. And when I first met Layla and Lavend, they had been in Mexico for 9 months. They had just completed a Spanish intensive program. And then I got to meet Sami as he was arriving into the country. And so I've been following them for, I guess, like 4 years now, and a whole pandemic later. So at that time, that when I first met them, they were not college students. They had just arrived into the country. They had a very interesting way of arriving into Mexico because they couldn't come through the United States because they couldn't even come in between. So so then Layla, she's currently an architecture student in Guadalajara. And then I have Sami over here. He's also an architecture student, but he's in Mexico City. And then Lavend, he does international relations currently. They're Lavend and Layla, they're both juniors, and then Sami is a sophomore right now. So some of the things, after looking at all of their data, I didn't know where I was going with this, to be honest, when I started looking at their data and kind of going with them. And then I started noticing how they're creating and navigating third spaces in their new context in a way for them to reconcile their lived experiences with their current life, and how they're constantly, very strategically shifting and performing identities. So they are becoming cultural brokers between Mexican society and their Arab, their Syrian, and their Kurdish cultures. So Layla and Lavend, they're both Kurds. Sami is not. But I mean, keep going because I feel like I'm going to run out of time. So as they created, so some, like some of these are the pictures. So one of the things is that they use third space. So third space, they're creating this in-betweenness in which they're using their experiences from their past life with their current experiences to create this new identity for themselves. And one of them is that of a student. So this is when I said that I do not call them refugees, they want to be called displaced students or international students. So when I asked them about it, because I noticed, they would never call themselves refugees, even though, like in the Mexican law, they are categorized as refugees. So when I asked them about that, they told me, and then Layla was the first one that told me, she was like, when I say refugee, people look at me differently. They associate me with war and turmoil and all of this negativity in my life. And she's like, but when I tell them that I am an international student, when I'm a student, even though in their university they're not categorized as international students, but she says like, when I conduct myself as an international student, it's like the way that people receive me is with hope, with admiration, so they're creating this new sense of self themselves, even though by law, I guess they're not categorized like that. So then they create this identity reconciliation third space in which they're reconciling these identities, their perception of what a student is and and there's perception about what a refugee means, and they're trying to meld and they're trying to create this new self in this new context where they are. So I'm going to skip. Social media became extremely relevant, not just because of COVID, but also because they're young adults. And social media is really like a way, a mirror into their lives. So I looked at Facebook and I looked at Instagram, and it was very interesting because in Facebook, you do your posts and you put your pictures, but Instagram with stories, a lot of them were able to capture what was happening in the moment. So I knew where they were, I knew what they were doing, and then it goes away in 24 hours. So I really was connected to my phone the entire time because I did not want those stories to go away. But it was very interesting to see how they were creating this third space using social media. And we know and we see third space we see social media as a third space, particularly in immigrant communities because it unites immigrants across borders, national borders, and it's a shared outlet to network and reminisce about our life. And as an immigrant myself, it's a way that I use to connect, with people back home all the time. And so it was the same thing that they did. They would use it to connect with, a family back home, users back home, people that they met during their journey from the refugee camp into Mexico. They had to be, because of the way that they arrived into the country, some of them, Sammy, for example, he was an entire month in Ecuador because he was waiting for, his permit. So even then, he met people, so he was still able to continue communicating with them. So those that they met and encountered during their journey, and then those with whom they were interacting in their everyday in Mexico. And in this case, mostly that their classmates and professors. So social media really became this third space where they used to preserve their Syrianness and their Arabness and to portray that. But they also, as they began experiencing life in Mexico, they came, already with an emotional connection with an ethnic group, with a particular ethnic group that they identified. But they were shifting between what it means to be Syrian in Mexico. It was, and I'll give you a couple of examples before I run out of time. So I know I'm okay. So Sammy, for example, so he used social media to reminisce about his lived experiences as he was grappling with the trauma and experiences from, from war. So he would repost a lot of old posts that he used to post. Back when he was in Syria, and how Facebook every now and then it gives you, the ability to share your memories. So he would share those memories from 3 years ago, 4 years ago when he was back home. And then he would sometimes make a comment on that. Or sometimes he would just post a picture. But that was a constant theme for him, And then there's this one right here. So I guess the original post was in 2016, and he put my attempt to restore the crack between me and humanity. And then when he reposted it, it's he made it before I started studying architecture, And at this time, Sammy was not even thinking about studying architecture. He wanted to be a journalist. And he wanted to document everything that was happening in his country. So he was able to capture it. So most of the pictures that I use in this presentation and other presentations, they were actually taken by him. And he told me, use them, diffuse them. But it was, it was his way of really grappling with that trauma that he had experienced for the past 9 years, and now trying to make sense the fact that now he is, thousands of miles away from his family, and he's actually in college and he's studying architecture, and he actually has a pathway that he can follow. Lavend, he also used social media to document his attempts again to reconcile his experiences. So the interesting thing about Lavend, so he's studying international studies, and he is a diplomat by heart, and he started volunteering and going to give talks and presentations, and not just to his institution, but he would go in this case, this is the state police office. And he would go and give presentations about, like he called it like the culture of peace, and started really reflecting on the state of affairs, in Syria and the current situation in Mexico. And he does a lot of comparisons about, from systems of government to just social, social interactions. He calls it like his call of action, and he takes it, and he still currently does it. He just did one, I think, last week, in which he continues to go and speaks, and he really takes that upon himself on sharing his experiences, on making sure, like he says, like he wants everybody to understand the dangers of, certain political ideologies, certain, lack of infrastructure, all of those things that led to the Syrian conflict, and how Mexico, and he sees himself as with all the problems that we have in our country, but he sees himself as very appreciative, and he takes it upon himself on making sure that he talks about that. And I'm really, really.
I'm so sorry, but
I know.
we'll have to.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. I will talk to you about Layla another day. She is fascinating. Again, as an Arabic woman, is a Kurdish woman, as a matter of fact, living in Mexico, and how she uses those elements, the Syrian and Kurdish elements, to portray herself. So we'll have to learn about Layla another day. But anyways, so all that to say, it was important for me to look at beyond the classroom. A lot of the literature on refugees and displaced populations happen within the classroom and happens within the European and US context and Australian context as well. So we really need to start looking at what is happening in other countries. How are we looking outside the classroom environment, and how are we having particularly displaced youth? How are they navigating and creating this very important identity in spaces at this stage of their life? So I will stop there.
Thank you. All right, moving right along, we've got Brenda Shein, who will present on cultural socialization and bicultural competence in Burmese refugee college students.
That's a PDF.
Not that
Nope.
one.
That's a PDF.
It's the center one.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You should be able to go into this.
I'm not good at slideshows.
Presentation.
Where's the option? Get 3 different forms of Zoom.
Can we do a slideshow on PDF?
I think so. I just don't remember.
Yes.
Usually it's like
I'm
down
not quite
and
sure either.
Hang on, let's try again. I can just advance it if you want. I don't.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
So for the final portion of today's session, I'll be sharing about a study that looked at the role of family and ethnic cultural socialization and its relation to bicultural competence in Burmese college students from refugee backgrounds. So just a little bit about kind of the context for how this research even got started. Back in summer 2020 and summer 2021, I was working with the Burmese American Community Institute, also known as BACI, and that's an NGO in Indianapolis that works primarily with Burmese refugees to help them with the post-resettlement process. So every summer, actually, for almost a decade now, BACI has been running an intensive 3-month summer research program for high schoolers in the community to design and conduct research projects on topics that are salient to their community. So I, along with my advisor, Dr. Zhou, was working as a lead researcher kind of mentor for these high scholars to teach them research methods and guide them at different stages of the research process. So It was a really cool opportunity for me to not only learn more about the community, but to also think about kind of the different stakeholders that had a vested interest in the research that we were conducting, as well as, of course, to develop meaningful relationships that ultimately enabled me to collect data of my own. So as folks have been mentioning already, Burmese refugees are one of the most largest and recently resettled refugee population in recent decades. Because of social political conflict and humanitarian crises, many have been forced to flee their homelands and come to countries like the US, where they've needed to navigate a bicultural identity and renegotiate belonging in these new and unfamiliar environments. The research on this population is quite limited, but we do know from past research that the post-resettlement experience can really complicate this process of cultural adjustment for refugee families. But what hasn't been studied as much in the literature are the bicultural experiences of refugee youth, including Burmese refugee college students. So this is kind of this gap in the literature is really what prompted us to study the role of families, specifically socialization, or the messages that parents pass along about culture to their children that may shape how Burmese refugee college students understand their dual cultural identities. So before I get into the study, I wanted to quickly clarify some concepts. So when I'm talking about this notion of bicultural competence, I'm specifically referring to individuals that have been born into two cultures or exposed to more than one culture, and their ability to combine or integrate aspects of the two cultures that they're a part of. So researchers have studied bicultural competence through this construct of bicultural identity integration, which consists of two distinct dimensions of bicultural blendedness and bicultural harmony. So bicultural blendedness measures the extent to which people perceive their identities as blended or overlapping, and then bicultural harmony reflects the extent to which people perceive their identities to be harmonious or compatible with one another. So you can kind of think about bicultural blendedness as reflecting this cognitive aspect of bicultural identity integration, and harmony as reflecting more of this affective nature of this construct. Next slide, please. And then the other concept that I wanted to quickly clarify is family cultural socialization, which refers to the ways that youth learn about a culture from their family and develop a sense of belonging to this culture. And this can take the form of parents passing along knowledge, values, or beliefs about their heritage or ethnic culture, but also about the mainstream American culture. Next slide, please. So in this study, we were primarily interested in looking at the relation between family, ethnic, and mainstream socialization, and our outcome variables of bicultural identity, bicultural harmony, and bicultural blendedness. And so we wanted to know whether parents' efforts to pass along information about their heritage culture or about the mainstream American culture might influence whether or not Burmese refugee college students felt like they can successfully balance their dual cultural identities. And we hypothesized that these constructs would be related, that family ethnic socialization would be positively and significantly related to bicultural identity integration. Next slide, please. So through snowball sampling, a lot of social media recruitment, and we even posted flyers throughout the community in places that the high schoolers that I was working with thought that other Burmese students might frequent in the community, like restaurants and grocery stores. We were able to collect a total of 96 participants. So in addition to some of the self-report measures that we gave the participants, we also collected demographic data on age, nativity status, English proficiency, gender. An interesting note about our sample is that our sample actually reflected a higher average length of resettlement. So most of the participants in our study had actually been living in the US for a little over 12 years at the time that we collected this data. So to try and answer our research questions, we then ran some correlation and regression analyses. And then we found that in running the correlation analyses, nativity status, English proficiency, and family ethnic socialization was correlated with greater bicultural blendedness. We didn't find any gender or age differences in any of our predictor or outcome variables. So partially supporting our hypotheses, we found that family ethnic socialization was significantly related to bicultural blendedness, but not bicultural harmony. Interestingly, for family mainstream socialization, that wasn't related to either dimension of bicultural identity integration. Another interesting aspect of our finding from our sample is that participants actually reported higher levels of family ethnic socialization than family mainstream socialization, which is actually seems to be consistent with past literature that suggests that, particularly in the late stages of later adolescence and emerging adulthood, other contextual influences such as one's relationships with their peers may potentially play a more significant role in the socialization and in that process of shaping bicultural identity development. So what these results, what the study's results allude to is really the importance of family ethnic socialization. So there's value in parents passing along and knowledge about their culture and sharing their heritage culture with their children when it comes to promoting the bicultural competence of Burmese refugee college students, especially when we think about how college tends to be a time when a lot of ethnic racial identity development is happening and students are kind of figuring out who they are. Family ethnic socialization can also play this really protective role by facilitating the development of critical bicultural competencies and helping students understand or manage their relationship to both cultures. From an intervention standpoint, because many refugees may continue to engage with community agencies after the post-resettlement process as they become more integrated and self-sufficient in their new environments, it might be helpful for those agencies to also continue supporting parent socialization efforts and encouraging open conversations and discussions about what it even looks like to navigate a bicultural identity at home and in the broader society and community. So providing more opportunities for Burmese refugee college students to continue reflecting on their sense of self and understanding of their identity can enable them to see their Burmese and American identities as overlapping, even if they encounter conflicts navigating that bicultural identity in different contexts. And these efforts can ultimately benefit their bicultural identity development and help to strengthen those intergenerational ties to the community.
Well, thank you, everybody. So we have about 14 minutes left for questions.
So I'm going to request that our panelists up here in the front, sitting towards us, maybe English up a little bit so that Al can catch you guys so our online participants can see you. See, I just flip the chairs around this way and kind of English up a little bit to the Al. Yeah, that's.
Thank you.
Okay, questions?
I always have a lot of questions, but.
I'm on the virtual, but you can do.
I'm trying to say, you can give me mine, I got other questions for all of you, but I'm gonna go, maybe start with Xiang. And is there a word for autism in these Burmese languages? And then how, is there acceptance of this as a real thing, or has there been some denial because there hasn't been a long tradition of considerations of mental health in some of the cultures? What's been your experience with that?
There are no words in their local languages. You know, given there are 100, I don't know every one of them, but for most of them we talk to, there are no equivalent. What we have found is parents, I didn't present the parent interview part, but a lot of parents either use the English word autism, they speak everything else in Falan or Shein, but that word is reserved in English, or they just describe a developmental delay or concern. In terms of acceptance, we were so far, it could be a sample bias, have been very surprised by the acceptance they reported to us. I think there are a few evidence, including part of the self-report, they felt like they don't experience sort of challenges or discrimination from their in-group members, which we have actually heard a lot from other Asian communities that we're doing parallel studies with. And two, their churches have formal support groups for them. I think that speaks volume because when that's where they're looking up to. So those are, I think, strong evidence of how they feel actually supported.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of related to that, I was surprised to hear that too, because I feel like sometimes and I don't want to essentialize like Asia or South Asia or anything like that, but countries that I'm familiar with very often, the thought is that, I'm speaking specifically about Japan where I have more familiarity, the thought is that kids aren't trying hard enough. There's sort of like an expression, gambare, like try your best, do your best. And so it's kind of blame the victim, kind of, blame the person themselves, and then essentially blame the family for not working enough with the kids. So I was surprised to,
I think those sentiments, I think there are a lot of individual family variability in terms of that piece. I think there are certainly a lot of myths still around. For example, I think a few clinicians spoke of, can you run a blood test to see what's wrong genetically? Right? They think they're attributing it to different things, right? So I think there are different attributions, and which is common to many different ethnic racial groups too. Do you see there are online questions?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I have.
I got a message that they were not able to type, I guess, questions.
No?
Yeah, like someone wanted.
Oh, okay.
they couldn't.
So can they just unmute and ask questions then?
They should be able to unmute as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
people type, so it's odd.
So do we have questions from virtual participant?
Yeah.
We can
just
type,
say
yeah.
Thank you, Annie.
I'll ask you another question. I'm trying to, which Brenda will I think I'm good. Dr. Brenda. I'm curious, I was really fascinated by this idea that don't call us refugee. And I know sometimes that words in some language can have different connotations than another. Is there something in particular about the word refugee in Spanish that carries a more negative connotation than what in English?
No, and so interestingly, when we had this first conversation, so because I've known them for some years now, it's been fascinating to really, continue following them because our very initial conversations were in English. English really was, our lingua franca at the beginning. And now when we talk, most of the time we do it in Spanish. So we've had that, like linguistic transition as well. And we do a lot of translanguaging, and I really wish I spoke Arabic because I don't know what I would encounter. So I was talking yesterday, but no, it was in English when I first talked about not being called refugees, and I think it was when we were doing, because I noticed, they really went around to not use it. So to me that was interesting. So I purposely asked them, is there a reason? And that's, the three of them. Well, actually, not just the three. There were more participants, but these three in particular, they were all very apprehensive to that word. So even the organization that has helped them, they talk about them as displaced population, displaced students.
Interesting.
I share an anecdotal story, because when you were presenting, I remember the story at one of the BACI Community Organization annual sort of board meeting. There are students doing presentations related to the community, and one board member, who's a white woman, actually questioned student saying you should never use the word immigrant. You should always use refugee. Because they felt like refugee elicited a paltering force and sympathy from white Americans like herself. Whereas immigrant felt like, oh, you're an immigrant, come here, take over our job.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Dr. Brenda, this is differentiate.
Our future, Dr. Brenda.
You use third space work
Yes.
to actually frame much of what you had to say today and maybe in your dissertation too. And specifically, what theories did you use? I'm curious about which third space ones you use. And then I'm curious about how you're contributing to that, because it seems like you're expanding it with that focus on a particular age group. and almost from a particular geographical context too, could enrich that third space discourse.
Yes, so I will tell you, third space was not even in my realm of possibilities. It just came, I think, through the data. So my learning gap in third space was this big. And then when I started delving into it, I was like, what did I uncover? What did I open? At that time, I think my familiar work with third spacing had to do with Nepantla and Anzaldúa and more like Mexican Chicano. Right. But I felt like it didn't fit. It wasn't fitting correctly. So I started reading Baba and Soya and that hybridity. And I felt like that was, in the cultural brokerage. And that's kind of like what I felt like they felt more of the thing. Because I started with my Anzaldúa lens, which was my own, third spacing. And then I realized like it didn't fit them because they're in a very particular situation themselves. So some of the things that I'm hoping, like to do with this work, other, like definitely the geographical, try to change the narrative a little bit on what, countries outside the U.S. It goes back to the PowerPoint about the like the U.S. does all of these wonderful things, but really thinking about like what are other places doing and really highlighting, that displaced populations, they're not just, present here, like in developed countries, but they're everywhere. And so one of the interesting things about, so one is kind of looking at this particular group that is very much under research, which is, adult youth. In this case, like I want to look at third space so social media is becoming more and more popular within third space. In this particular work, I'm using social media jointly with like in person. So that it's been something that I've seen one or the other. It's hard to still find two. And it's interesting because it depicts very different, like what a person is in person, what we display in our performance is very different than what we're performing in our social media interactions. So that's another part, like third spacing in social media and how important really it becomes in creating this bridge within displaced population and immigrant communities as they're navigating their new spaces. So that's kind of like where I'm going for, just because I think it's really cool, and it's very interesting, and it really showed them. I think that's until I looked at it that way, that's when I started finding the third space that I wanted to look at, when I started looking at that hybridity, when I started looking at their Instagram stories of them, like making traditional Syrian food, but like they would put Mexican music, and so they would start creating and blending, and or talking to them, and obviously, don't have all of the ingredients, but then they're starting to use the local ingredients into their cuisine, and starting to create their own versions of it, which I hope one day I'll write a cookbook, that's my dream, to really use, like food became very important as I was halfway through my dissertation, and I'm like, man, I should have focused on the food, but I was already too into it, Next article, yeah, but it's fascinating, how they really are creating those spaces, and especially because they don't have their family with them, so that's another thing, that the importance that social media has in connecting them to their family, because they don't know when they're going to see them again. Their families, some of them are still in a refugee camp. Some of them, they're in a city that is like cited, so they cannot get out, and they cannot go visit. They can't go back. So there is also that uncertainty. So social media really plays a very crucial part in their emotional development as young professionals.
Nancy, I think there's a lot you could
Oh my
contribute
God,
to
yeah.
that literature.
There's
Deciding
a-
what you're gonna
I
do
know,
first,
so many things.
All right, it looks like there's a question in the chat.
There is? That
There's a
just says
hand, there's a
they-
hand up.
Is that Brianna?
Oh, it says they may not have the.
Oh, Brianna.
Yes. Oh,
Wanna
Can
unmute
you
Brianna?
all hear me?
If-
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have a question about the third space community that you were referring to on social media. So were they interacting together as a group, or were you just looking at their individual posts on social media?
It's all their individual, these were all their personal accounts. So two of my participants, the two male ones, they were actually roommates. So sometimes they would post things together, but other times they would post things separately. And then Layla, she lived in a different city. So sometimes, and because of COVID, they didn't get to see each other. They used to come together at the end of the semester, all of them, and sometimes they post things together. So sometimes I do find them, like they see each other, but these were all like individual groups. Their personal accounts for Facebook and for Instagram. And one interesting thing is like I started noticing later on in Instagram, you have the ability of like limiting who sees your posts. So there were certain posts that showed up like they were like only being shared to close people. So there were certain things I think that they started not wanting to perform, particularly Layla. And that's why I think she's fascinating because of the way that she is like, and like really, what's the word? Like she's like developing herself as a woman, like in Mexico. And certain things, I think that she's still not sure if she can share certain things with her social media. But yeah.
Hidden third space. Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's like a third person, I know. It was like
Wow.
within, yeah.
Quick question for future Dr. Brenda. So really fascinating work. And so I guess it's a two-part question. So one, when you had the constructs of like the family socialization, if you could talk to, was that self-reported by the students or their families? And then a general pattern I've seen with some refugee and immigrant populations is K-12, there's a lot of pressure to assimilate. And then once you get to college, there's less pressure. You can kind of try to reconnect all those things you're trying to reject from your own culture, try to reconnect. So I'm curious if you saw any patterns like that.
So with respect to your first question, it was participants that self-reported on their family ethnic and racial situation. And then your second question, I think can you clarify or rephrase that?
Yeah, so the pattern I've seen is when refugee or immigrant students are in K-12, depending on where they live, but generally there's a pattern where there's a lot of pressure to assimilate and acculturate, and that's just kind of the nature of our K-12 system. But once they get into college, sometimes it's like, wow, I've lost my language, I've lost my culture, I want to try to reconnect, because in college there's more of an emphasis, I guess, on individuals and finding yourself and finding your voice, and less conformity on fitting in. So I'm curious if you saw a similar pattern with the students you studied.
In our sample, we also collected data on friendship. So they would report on, I think, like 5 of their closest friends. I think we were surprised to see that participants not only reported close friends that also identified as Burmese or another Burmese ethnic group, but also I think diverse group of friendships. I don't know if that reflects kind of the broader Burmese community as a whole, and if that says anything about their attempts to assimilate into the community. But I just thought that was really interesting.
That was at the college level, those friendships? Okay.
That's a good question. The other studies definitely we have conducted have seen that pattern among all I guess POC students in general. But I don't think our data is adequately can speak to that particular empirical evidence. We do find it's interesting because we work with so many high schools directly, and they come from schools in the Southport district where have such high concentration of Burmese students. So I felt like compared to some other POC students who have worked as a college setting, where a lot of people, never seen another Black student or Asian student in my school. These students have seen a lot. They're socialized a lot around them. So I wonder about that too.
Yeah, I was blown away. Southport High School, the student newspaper was in English, Spanish, and Burmese. That wasn't the case for a lot of the Southeast Asian refugee students I worked with in the 80s and 90s. It was almost unheard of. So maybe we made some progress. I don't know.
That's interesting, because I'm thinking about, like teacher candidates, in particular bilingual teacher candidates who reject you know, like, so not much as their identity, but they reject their linguistic identity as Spanish speakers during, you know, like the K-12. And then when they come, you know, into higher ed, you know, some of, you know, like you know, looking, like examining their narratives, they all have like that moment in which they realize, you know, how important, and they're trying to like reclaim that, you know, that language, that voice, that identity, and how important it is. But they all talk about, particularly like in middle school, I believe it's like when they find themselves like, they see it as, you know, like their identity constricting them from like their social, you know, interactions. And then somehow, I guess, as they get older, they realize, you know, the importance of it, so they're trying to reclaim it during those college years. Yeah.
Those was tough for everybody, right?
Oh my God, yeah, I know, yeah.
I don't know if there's time for just a quick question. You talked about bicultural identity. Do they actually, do some of them not just identify as bicultural? Because they seem like they've got more than, because the chart that you had earlier was all the different languages that they speak. So that implies to me maybe different ethnic groups. So to say somebody's Burmese is, I need a little clarification around that because there's so many ethnic groups. So is it Burmese and American, is that?
Yeah, so the questions we were, this scale I think allows you to put in the ethnic culture. And so we just kind of did a catch-all like Burmese culture and mainstream American culture, and using those as our construct variables.
Okay, so they didn't then identify as any subgroup within?
They did, yes.
But for your analysis?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
That's actually a challenge for recruitment as well, like what to write in as recruiting your participants. So we have tried a variety because we don't want to put a label on. So we sometimes use language to try, like, if you identify someone from Burma as one of ethnic groups in there rather than Burmese, because a lot of them actually do not want the title. There are groups such as Cantonese. If you say Burmese, they will definitely not participate in your study because they're not Burmese, even though they're from Burma. So how to even recruit can be a challenge with that.
I remember one participant that I was recruiting, or the same from one of the social media recruitments that I did. She had actually sent me a message saying that she thought it was really disrespectful that the way that I was promoting my recruitment was trying to recruit Burmese participants because she identified as one of the ethnic groups that had political conflicts back home in Burma and Myanmar, and didn't like that. And so she gave me really constructive feedback, but I think it sparked a really productive conversation about kind of what I was trying to get out of my study, and how it could still like be respectful of her ethnic group.
Yeah.
So maybe like a highly qualitative component might get at some of those, enrich it because it gets some of those differences. Right.
Just want to add a quick point to that. Like back to the thing you were telling about refugees and immigrants, like why do some people prefer not to be called like refugees? I think, well, I don't know, but even if you conducted that research paper back in my home country, they're all Middle East and stuff. So people would think that you're showing charity towards refugees, and that is not what we want. We are immigrants, as in we don't need you guys to be there for us. We're just moving the country. But if it is refugees, we are seeking help from people. We're seeking refuge, so that's not what we want to be called. Yeah. So I think that could be one of the factors. But
and that's kind of they were I say that word and right away, people look at me differently. I tell them in this case that I'm a student, an international student, even though they're not international students. Yeah. But they felt more, just a self of accomplishment, and they talked about it, and I thought it was very interesting, how they were shaping their identity.
All right, well, we're a few minutes over, so thank you all so much for